what has nature wrought? Or I think perhaps we might simplify the situation a bit by thinking back to an earlier period, at least as far as my contribution is concerned, how fragmented this whole area was some years ago. And the example would be simply the definitions of leadership. Was Hitler a leader, despite, of course, they considered themselves a leader? Not much concern there for followership. I mean, he obviously mobilized followers, but he was the dominant figure. We spend a lot of time, those of us who discussed all this, using a rather simple example, and that is a politician is walking down Main Street in a little town and looks across the road, and there is a woman coming up on the other side, and he's running for office, so naturally he makes the first effort, and you would think he was the only person acting as a leader. But she is already acting as a leader by being who she is, because he looks at her, if he knows something about her, or maybe how she's dressed or whatever, influences him at the very start. So you get right away into the interlocking, the interaction of leader and follower, which makes it, of course, more interesting, more complex. The other point I'd make at the moment, and I really would like to defer to some of the people who've been working more recently on all this, as we are doing here, so I'll just conclude with this, is the question of whether we were simply trying to do too much. At least in my case, perhaps I was trying to do too much. Now, getting back to the little example of the politician, there is, of course, a psychological aspect involved there. And one of the big questions about a general theory of leadership is, should it include the psychological aspect? I don't see how it could not include the psychological aspect, but if you bring in the psychological aspect, you immensely complicate, obviously, the study of development of a general theory. So these are rather scattered remarks in response to some rather scattered observations that have been made already, and I'd like to leave it there because really to examine this subject, as I and others have had to do over the years, is a matter of taking years of work and study of history, psychology, and poli-sci and so on, politics. And all I can do is say that I'm very pleased that this is still a major question that we're discussing here. Appreciate very much what has been said and would like to defer to others who have done more recent work on this than I have done.
The thing that I heard that I disturbed me was my own presentation.
Can you live with yourself?
I think I went through too fast and stepped on some of the bottom lines. I do, in fact, believe that leadership does make a difference. Our chapter was dealing specifically with leadership and causality. But I believe that leadership is a necessary but not sufficient condition for change. And that people can do the very same actions in the very same place at different times, or at different times in the very same place. And sometimes it leads to another set of events that bring about change, and sometimes it does not. And that was the point of that of that chart with the many different factors. I mean, if you want to understand Barbara Rose Jones, you have to go back to slavery and the slave community and the experience of the Freedmen's Bureau. And as such, it testifies that leadership is interdisciplinary study that takes into account all kinds of very complex matters for complete and full understanding. But the bottom line is that it is necessary but not sufficient condition for bringing about change, and that at any time, it seems to me, that leadership's essential characteristic is taking initiative on behalf of shared values. That whatever box you look at in that chart, you have people who came together to take initiative on behalf of values, sometimes preserving segregation, sometimes working to break it down. Some were successful, some were not, and some would become successful over time. And I think some of the most promising work that we have regarding putting all of that together is the work that Russ is doing with the integral theory, and I hope Russ will have a chance to talk about that. And in terms of all the relationship of all of this to legitimation of the field, Brad Jackson has a book out on the table. It's called A Fairly Short, Fairly Interesting, and Modestly Inexpensive Book. And all of that is true except for the last part. It costs a lot, especially for its size. But they take on very specifically this question of how do we legitimate the study of leadership studies within academia, and it is a wonderful synthesis of pretty high-powered scholarship, and not only that, but the tradition that we inherit. I mean, after all, the question of political leadership was the burning question of philosophy and most of the serious thinkers up until the 20th century, and we are part of that tradition, and it has always been the subject of very serious discourse among people who take thinking and social arrangement seriously, and we are heirs to that tradition.